Tantor Audio presents Wellspring of Chaos by L.E. Modesitt, Jr. Narrated by Kirby Heyborne. Cooper 1. Kharl stood at the front window of his shop, looking westward for a moment at the wedge of twilight sky visible between the slate roofs of the buildings on the far side of the narrow crafter's lane. A single lamp was visible through the middle window of Garen's quarters above the weaver's shop. Next door at Hamill's, both the lower floor and the rooms above were dark. That wasn't surprising, Kharl told himself, since Hamill's consort had taken the children to her parents' holding to help with the early midsummer gathering. That had left the potter free to indulge himself at the tankard, and the lane peaceful, since Kharl's neighbor, the scrivener Tierbell, was a widower and kept a quiet establishment. Lowering his eyes, the cooper glanced at the 5 barrels in his display, all tight cooperage from the best white oak, ranging from the hogshead to the standard barrel, and down to the quarter barrel and the fine-finished 5th barrel with the brass spigot, used by anyone who wanted to store and dispense expensive liquids, mostly spirits. Then he barred the front door and closed the shutters behind the lead-glassed panes that his grandsire had installed before Kharl had been born. At that time, glass windows had been considered particularly foolish for a cooper, unlike a goldsmith or an artisan, or even a weaver or a potter, who had to display work to attract buyers. Times had changed, and most shops along the lane had come to display their wares behind windows.
A barrel's a barrel. So's a hogshead. People buy barrels because they need barrels.
Kharl smiled as he recalled the acerbic words of his grandmother, who had never let his grandsire forget what she regarded as the foolishness of the glass. Foolishness? Kharl didn't think so. He still got orders from passers-by who otherwise hadn't thought about barrels. Not many, never more than 1 in 8 days, and sometimes only a few a season. Over time, though, the windows had paid for themselves. He picked up the lamp and walked toward the rear of the shop, past the high racks that held the billets he would form into staves. Most of the billets were oak, white for the tight cooperage and red for slack. There were also some billets of tight-grained black oak and a few of chestnut. He passed the workbench and the tool rack, with every tool in place. On the left side of the rear wall was the small forge where he sized and shaped the hoops for tight cooperage. Beside the forge on the brick flooring was the fire pot, and beside it, the steaming ring. The faintest smell of ashes and charcoal drifted toward Kharl from the banked coals of the forge. Just short of the rear wall and the door to the loading dock, the cooper stopped and looked at the 15 white oak barrels waiting there. Each was identical to the next, with the iron bands set just so, and the smooth finish with a medium toasting on the inside. Corlin was supposed to pick them up in the morning, pick them up and pay the balance due. The vintner had taken the first 15 barrels an 8 days earlier. Kharl only hoped that the vintner did not come up with some excuse, as he had the summer before, waiting almost 2 8 days before showing up. But then that was the problem in dealing with someone who lived more than 10 k's to the south of Brysta. Kharl half smiled, then nodded and turned, the carry lamp in hand, to head up the stairs. "Silvers and coppers are not for me, but a pretty girl whose charms are free." He frowned. Had he heard singing in the alley? The tankard was 4 doors toward the harbor, but seldom did roisterers come wandering down the alley, even early in the evening. Kharl cocked his head. "For when there's no lamps to see, any woman's as fair can be."
"No! Let go of me!"
The woman's voice, no, it was a girl's voice, was familiar, but Kharl could not place it. He moved to the far side of the loading dock and swept up the cudgel in his left hand, then, leaving the lamp behind, eased the door open.
"Let me go!" "Mean you no harm, little woman?"
A raucous laugh followed.
"We'll even pay you for what you give others for free." "Let go! Let—"
The girl's words were choked off. Kharl closed the door behind him so that he would not be silhouetted by the light from the lamp. He glanced toward the tankard, but saw no one. He looked back to the north. There, less than a rod away, perhaps less than 10 cubits, in the fading light and the dimness of the alley, were 3 figures that Kharl could barely make out. 2 men held the girl, a thin figure with dark ringlets over a green summer blouse. The hair and the blouse belonged to Sanil, the youngest of Tirbel's daughters. One of the men had Sanil's arms cruelly twisted behind her, and the other had his hand on her shoulder, pulling the summer blouse down. Both men were laughing. Kharl took 3 quick steps, then 2 more, bringing the cudgel up. The nearer man, the one who had started to rip away Sanil's blouse, turned. A blade hissed from the scabbard at his belt. Kharl took another step and struck the blade and the man's hand with the cudgel before the man had finished turning toward the cooper. The short sword dropped on the cobblestones of the alley with a muffled clank.
"Ah, swine slime, misbegotten!"
The youth jumped back, cradling his hand. The dark blue velvet of his tunic was almost lost in the dimness. The second man let go of Sanil, and his right hand darted toward the hilt of his blade.
"Don't,"
growled the cooper.
"Less you want a broken arm. Just let her go and back away and head back where you came from. Have fun with your own or those you pay."
As soon as the man had released her, Sanil slipped away into the shadows. There was a glint on the heavy brass key she held, and then the rear door of the structure beside the cooperage opened and quickly shut.
"You can't do this."
The taller young man, who was still half a head shorter than the cooper, kept his hand on the hilt of his blade, but did not draw it.
"You don't know who you're talking to." "Doesn't matter," growled the cooper. "Don't force girls barely old enough to know the difference between boys and men. They're all the same."
Kharl raised the cudgel slightly.
"Back off, little man, lest you never want to use that arm again."
The shorter youth scooped up the fallen blade with his left hand and backed away. After a moment, the taller one followed. Kharl stood watching until the 2 were out of sight, and until the alley was quiet once more. Then he turned and re-entered the cooperage, wondering from what merchants' houses had come the overdressed and spoiled youths. With a snort, he set down the heavy cudgel and barred the door. After reclaiming the lamp, he started up the steps to the quarters above the cooperage. His boots thumped heavily on the wood, and the 4th step creaked, as it had for years. Cherie stood just inside the door at the top of the stairs. Shoulder-length black hair was bound back from her face, making it seem even narrower than it was. Her green eyes were cool.
"Your supper's cold. Thought you were coming up sooner."
"I was. Heard something out back. Wanted to make sure that it wasn't someone trying to break in. Just a pair of youngsters. Thought they were men. Drinking too much for one so young." Kharl had no intention of saying more about the would-be bravos. For all her virtues, Cherie lacked one, that of circumspection. The young men could scarcely have picked out one crafter in gray from another, not unless Cherie told the entire lane. Because she well might have, while suggesting that Kharl was being foolish, Kharl saw little point in calling attention to the incident. Sanil would doubtless tell her widower father, but the scrivener was more than taciturn, as were his children.
"Won't you ever leave well enough alone, Kharl? Leave the roisterers alone.
or if you must, call them to the attention of Lord West's watch. That's what he draws his terrors for. You've got a consort and sons that need you.
My hard-won coins, leastwise. Kharl shut the door to the stairs and the shop below, and walked toward the washroom on the right side of the landing.
Let's not be starting that again.
Kharl forced a smile. I won't, dearest. I need to wash up. The pitcher on the wash table was full, and the basin empty and clean, with a worn but clean grey towel and a narrow bar of fat soap laid out on the left side. He closed the washroom door and began to wash, enjoying the faint rose scent that came from the petals in the soap. It took time to get the sawdust off his face and hands and arms, and out of his dark beard, short-cropped as it was. When Kharl stepped into the main room, it was still warm from the day, but the harbor breeze blowing through the open windows offered a welcoming coolness, even if it did bear the scents of salt and fish, and caused the 2 wall lamps to flicker. The cooper walked toward the round table where Arthal and Worrell waited, their eyes following him, but not exactly looking at him. "Did you finish your lessons?" Kharl's eyes fixed on Worrell, his younger son, by 3 years.
"Yes, sir, I did."
After a moment, the younger boy asked,
"How much longer will I have to go to Master Farnwile?"
"Until he says you can read and write well enough to pass the craftmaster's tests." Kharl seated himself.
"I don't see why," interrupted Arthal. "It's not as though we'll ever have the gold to post the bond for Master Crafter."
"Maybe so, and maybe not," replied Kharl. "But if you get the chance, I don't want you looking back and complaining that I didn't prepare you. Reading and writing aren't something you can pick up easy like when you're older."
"But what use is it if you're not a master crafter or a merchant or a lord? You scarce have a chance to read a broadsheet."
"But I can, and once or twice it saved me good coins." "Enough!" Kharl managed not to snap. "Let's enjoy supper."
As if she had been waiting for them to stop, Cherie lifted the heavy cast-iron stew-pot off the stove and carried it to the table. There she set it on the well-browned trivet in the center of the oval oak table that had been one of the first pieces of actual furniture that Kharl had made after he had taken over the cooperage. His consort set the large basket of afternoon baked bread on the table and seated herself at the opposite end of the oval table from Kharl. Kharl began to ladle the stew into the chipped brown crockery bowls that had come from Cherie's mother.
"Smells good," offered Kharl.
"It does," added Worrell.
"More summer squash and potatoes than meat," murmured Arthal. "It's tasty and it's hot, and you didn't have to spend the day cooking it," Kharl pointed out. "If you'd rather not eat, you can leave the table right now."
"No, Dad. I'm sorry, Ma."
Arthal's voice was barely apologetic. Kharl didn't feel like calling his older son on his borderline rudeness, not after a long day finishing the last of the barrels for Corlin, especially when he knew that Arthal would just make some other comment.
"What was going on outside, Dad?" asked Worrell.
"Just some young fellows who'd had too much at the tankard. Had more ale than sense and didn't know it."
"Will the watch catch them?"
"They settled down," Kharl said, after taking a mouthful of the stew, still warm and peppery, despite Cherie's comments about it getting cold. "Good stew."
He broke off a chunk of the crusty bread, then dipped it into the stew before chewing off the dipped end.
"Good bread."
"They'd better settle down," offered Arthal. "Lord West likes Brysta peaceful."
"The justices worry more about thieves and killers," Kharl said, taking a swallow of the warm ale, really only about half a mug for each of them, but that had been all that was left in the quarter barrel in the cellar, and he couldn't afford any more, not until Corlin paid him for the wine barrels.
"Castle said they hung 3 brigands in the Justices' Hall on Tuesday," added Worrell. "He was there."
"They hung 3 men, that's true. They might even have been guilty."
Kharl had his doubts that everyone hanged was as guilty as charged. "Does it matter if one brigand is strung up for something he didn't do?" asked Cherie. "Anyone they catch has done more than enough anyway. Weren't for Lord West, we'd have thieves overrunning Brysta, like in his sire's time." "That was a different time," Kharl said. "Fairvin had fallen. The more powerful steam engines had exploded. Many trading ventures had failed. People were starving, and white wizards were everywhere." "Better the whites than those blackstaffers from Recluce," Cherie sniffed. "Them and their fine clothes and their noses in the air. Think they know everything. Father Joram says that we're all equal in the eyes of the sovereign." Kharl wasn't about to get into debating the opinions of the priest of the one-God believers. "I can't see as they harm anyone, but it's better that they stay in Recluce." He took another chunk of bread and wiped out his empty bowl with it. "Good dinner, dearest." "How would we know? The lords won't touch 'em, not unless they're caught doing something right awful. Moraine, she listened to one of 'em last winter's end it was, and he was telling terrible tales. Terrible tales." "What kind of tales?" asked Kharl, in spite of himself. He had his doubts about Cherie's older sister Moraine, although Moraine was certainly good-hearted, and she and her consort were more than successful with the pear-apple and peach orchard that Dowsel had inherited from his father. He paused. "Didn't know blackstaffers got so far south as Peach Hill or Eolia." "They get everywhere," Miragni was saying. "And the tales he told! Terrible," she said, "about how a body can't even walk across some hills in Kanda without turning black and shriveling up and dying right there on the spot." "That may be," Kharl replied. "That's Kandar and not Nordla. Lord West is lucky to have one or two wizards that he can count on. Rather have him with wizards than some of the other lords of the quadrant." "This young blackstaffer, he said that the lord's wizards weren't proper mages. Of course, Father Joram says all wizardry is evil." "I wouldn't know if they're proper wizards." Kharl tilted his mug to get the last drop of ale. "I'm a cooper, not a wizard or a lord. That's their business. Mine's barrels. Solid barrels." "Terrible stuff, magery," Cherie sniffed again. "As bad as thieves and brigands, if you ask me." "I'm sure there are good mages and bad ones. There are good lords and bad ones, good coopers and bad ones." "No such thing as a good mage, if you ask me. Lord West can have them all. Be better if he hung 'em." "That's what lords are for. Deal with raiders and invaders and brigands and mages. Rather be a cooper." Worrell yawned. So did Arthur. "You two can take the bowls to the wash-table," Cherie said. "Wish we had a sister like Obrit does," mumbled Worrell. "Do all the dishes." "You don't have a sister," Cherie said. "Two of you are enough." "Always say that," murmured Arthur. "Did you say something?" asked Kharl. "No, sir." "I didn't think so." Kharl pushed back his chair and walked to the window, letting the cool evening air flow around him. He hoped that Corlin would pick up the barrels in the morning. 2. Right after his early breakfast, Kharl took the broom and stepped outside the front of the cooperage to sweep the stones of the narrow sidewalk. Worrell was supposed to have done it, but the boy was already laying out the white oak shooks that Kharl would be jointing for the hogshead ordered by Captain Haken for the sea stag. It was less trouble for Kharl to sweep than to rail at Worrell, and at least the boy was already working, unlike his older brother. Since the cooper didn't want to be caught out front if Corlin drove his wagon up to the loading door in the rear, Kharl swept quickly. Every few moments, Kharl stopped briefly to listen, although he doubted that the vintner would arrive before mid-morning, but with Corlin one could never tell. The air already felt hot and damp. He glanced to the east, at the barrel set on the stone slab between the cooperage and Durden's woolen shop, the barrel filled with damp sand for use against fires. The water barrel was more toward the harbor, past Tyrrell's scriptorium. He began to sweep again, trying not to sneeze. As gently as he moved the broom, dust still rose from the stones, dust from a long and dry summer. With the prevailing easterlies, Brysta was hot and damp, but seldom had much rain until late summer. So the air was moist, and the streets were dusty. Finally, he lifted the broom and turned to re-enter the cooperage. Kharl looked up. Tyrrell stood there, with a small smudge of ink on his jaw. Kharl, just wanted to... Last night, Sanil... The angular scrivener did not meet the cooper's eyes. Asked her to deliver some fancy cards up the hill. They must have followed her back. Just fortunate to be back by the loading dock. Might not have heard otherwise. Some would have heard and done nothing, Tyrrell replied. I owe you thanks and more. You don't owe me. Neighbours don't look out for neighbours. Who will? Kharl smiled. She's a good girl. Best of them all, Tyrrell agreed. Do you know who they were? Kharl shook his head, still listening for Corlin's team and wagon. No, wore velvets and blades. Looked like some merchants' spoiled brats. Had too much to drink and didn't care who they hurt. Sanil said they drew against you. Had my cudgel. Worked better. Kharl laughed brusquely. I hope they were very drunk and didn't know exactly where they were, offered Tyrrell. Merchants' sons. Well, some of them don't forget. Sometimes wealth is the wellspring of chaos. It was dark, Kharl replied, glancing toward the inside of his shop. I won't keep you. I'm waiting for Corlin, and I don't want him to load his barrels without leaving what's in his purse. Tyrrell laughed. I understand. It took me 8 days to collect from him for making a copy of Emil's Tales. The scrivener paused. But I did want to thank you. Neighbours or not, most wouldn't put themselves out. Been my daughter, I'd have wanted someone to put themselves out, Kharl said. She's always been thoughtful to us. She is. Tyrrell smiled. That she is. After a moment, he cleared his throat. I must be going. I have to go to the Quadrant Hall. Copying some records? Exactly. I can't really say who or why, you understand? Kharl didn't and never had, but he nodded anyway. Thank you, my friend, said Tyrrell as he turned. Kharl lifted the broom and headed back into the shop. Worrell looked up. The shooks are here, Da, and there are 2 extra, like you said. Except for the 2 of them, the cooperage was empty. Good. Kharl looked around. Arthur? I'm coming. The lanky, dark-haired youth slumped as he made his way down the stairs from above. I'm coming. He paused on the 4th step and rocked back and forth until the step squeaked. So is year-end, suggested Kharl, and it well might get here before you. He waited until his older son reached the workbench before continuing. Smythel promised he would have the iron blanks for the hogshead last night. I need you to pick them up. Tell him I'll stop by with the coins later today. Yes, sir. What if he wants the coins now? He won't, but if he does, then come get me. Kharl watched for a moment as Arthur left, not quite slouching, but not exactly hastening either. Then he turned. During Kharl's conversation with Arthur, Worrell had laid out the hollowing knife and the round shave. The younger boy stood at the end of the main workbench. Have you sharpened the hollowing knife? And the planer blade? Kharl looked at Worrell. I sharpened the blade the day before yesterday, Da.
The redhead looked down, not meeting his father's eyes. That was the day before yesterday. Today we have heavy oak to joint.
Yes, sir.
Worrell's tone was so resigned that Kharl had trouble not smiling in response before he replied, "The sooner you start, the sooner you'll be done. And then you can head off to Master Fonwile's."
Yes, sir.
The younger boy's tone was even more resigned. Kharl was not amused at Worrell's lack of enthusiasm about his tutor and his lessons, not with the coppers they were costing Kharl. 3. First thing on 5 Day, Kharl had opened the loading door and left it ajar, waiting as he was for a teamster he'd hired to cart the finished hogshead, standing just inside the door, down to the sea stag. Kharl had tried to complete the cask earlier, but he'd had to wait for Smythel to finish the iron blanks that Kharl forged into hoops, and that had meant sending Arthel twice. The Austrian trader wasn't due to cast off until tomorrow, on 6 Day, but Kharl found himself glancing at the large cask and loading door again and again as he continued to plane and joint the small black oak staves for the set of fancy 5th barrels for Ewald. He'd already commissioned the brass spigots, and he'd have to pay a silver to cooperage before 8 Day. Arthel was at the other workbench, rough-shaping red oak shooks into proper staves for flour barrels, not that Kharl had any orders, but because he always had some from Modesitt, the miller, come harvest. That was good, because fast as he made coins, it seemed as though he had to spend them almost as swiftly. Hot, damp air seeped into the shop as always in summer in Brysta. Kharl hoped it wouldn't be too long before the winds changed and Nordla got some rain, but the easterlies had lasted longer this summer. The cooper blotted his forehead with the back of his forearm before pausing and readjusting the plane.
"Gia!"
At the teamster's call and the crack of a whip, Kharl set aside the plane.
"Arthel, the teamster's here. I'll need you to help load the hogshead."
"Yes, sir." Arthel straightened. The two walked back to the loading door. Kharl opened the door wide. From there, Kharl watched as the teamster brought the wagon and team to a halt. Kharl knew many of the teamsters, but not the burly and bearded young man on the wagon seat. Not that he'd had a choice. A crafter put in a request at the teamster's hall and took what he got. He stepped into the alley.
"I'm Kharl, the cooper with the hogshead for the ocean pier."
"Morat." The teamster spat out onto the alley, the side of the wagon away from Kharl.
"Be 2 coppers down to the pier, and 2 back if it comes to that."
Kharl showed 4 coppers.
"But not until we're at the pier. And you tie the hogshead in place and I check it. We don't move till I think it's secure."
"I expected that." The brawny teamster lowered the rear wagon gate, and Kharl and Arthel lifted the hogshead and eased it into the wagon, while Kharl lashed the cask, equivalent to 3 barrels, in place in the wagon bed. Morat closed the rear gate. Arthel watched both men. Kharl tied the last knot and looked at his eldest.
"Close the loading door and watch the shop until I get back. Keep working on those staves."
"Yes, sir," replied Arthel. With a nod to his son, the cooper looked to the teamster.
"Casks in place."
Kharl climbed up into the wagon seat, waiting for Morat to finish checking the lashings. After a moment, the teamster vaulted into his seat and released the wagon brake.
"We'll be going."
He flicked the leads to his team. The wagon rolled forward, slowly. After Morat had the wagon and team clear of the alley behind the cooperage and on to 5th Cross, he kept the team on the crossing street until they reached Cargo Road. There he turned westward toward the harbor.
"First ocean pier, you said? The Sea Stag, Austrian deep water, Once the wagon passed the square at Third Cross, Kharl could see the piers.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?